is very much impacted by the presidential election cycle. How are you feeling these days?
Well, I will tell you that I feel great about the campaign. I think the presidential election cycle is always helpful in an election, but this one particularly so, because you have the antics of Donald Trump that have significantly stirred up people and created much more interest in this election cycle, I think, than any interest I've ever seen before. So I'm feeling pretty good about it all.
How are you feeling about just watching the convention so far?
Well, I will tell you, it's hard to watch because it's been so messy and so angry, and the rhetoric is really hateful. I mean, and personal. You know, calling someone Lucifer or calling. I mean, I really, that is not a very optimistic party. But I will tell you that on the other hand, I think the American people see that, and I really am. Every day when I block walk in the district, I meet people who are working hard, that trying to make a better living for their families, and really have a lot of faith and confidence in the country. They're worried about security, financial security. They're worried about the economy. They're worried about putting food on the table, but they're going at it as hard as they can to make sure they make a better life. And those are the folks, I think, that we need to help.
All right. Well, yesterday the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled the requirement for voters to present an ID at the polls is discriminatory. We just did that story. How does that affect your district and the upcoming election? We did mention that it's heavily Hispanic.
Well, there was a study by Rice and the University of Houston that showed that voter ID law was actually the deciding factor, that about 5 out of every 6 or 7 people who didn't vote because of the lack of ID would have voted for me over the course of the last election, and that was what made the difference. This time around, I think while the law won't be in place, the truth is that the damage is somewhat done, because people still, I mean, in some places, I can think of a county where you had a sheriff and sheriff's deputies out in polling places telling people that if they didn't have their ID and they tried to vote, that they would be arrested. And so there was a lot of intimidation. And this time around, I think you won't see that. You know, it shouldn't be, in theory. I mean, when people talk about voter ID, what's the big deal in showing my driver's license? And they don't understand, well, it's not. That's not the problem. The problem is what forms of ID were available. For example, if you're 85 or 90 and you're not driving anymore, does that mean you shouldn't be able to vote because you don't have a driver's license? Does that mean, if you're a student, for example, at Colorado State University or UTEP, and you have a government-issued ID because those IDs are good, but according to the Texas law, that student ID wasn't good enough. So they picked and they chose certain groups of people, right, and made it harder for certain groups of people to vote. And that was the problem with voter ID. That's why the courts have stepped in and said the way that you drew these guidelines for what ID was necessary, the ID itself is not the issue. It's what ID is acceptable and how you get that. And I think that makes all the difference in the world.
Okay, I want to get one more question in here before you go. The Dallas Morning News, Univision, and the Cronkite School of Journalism at ASU just released a new poll on Monday capturing views on the border. Most people on either side of the border, they don't want a border wall. You've been in Washington. How do you explain the real border reality of living here compared to what the viewpoint might be from people who live elsewhere?
Well, the challenge is that people who drive border policy have never been on the border, have never lived on the border, don't understand the border, and that's really the challenge of Congress. If you would let people locally have input into how we should do this, then you'd be able to solve the problem in a matter of minutes. But I will tell you, Mr. Trump has certainly focused on the border with his wall issue, with the comments that he's made about Latinos and rapists and thugs and all of these kinds of things, which I think are frankly incredibly disrespectful of the people who live out here. And I've been very disappointed that most Republicans have not stood up and said, that's not an accurate picture. And so for me, the policies are not driven by what's good for the region. They're driven more by what's good politics to get somebody elected. And I've been disappointed at seeing the comments that Mr. Trump has made. And frankly, I've been very disappointed that Mr. Hurd hasn't stood up to defend our part of the world and said, no, people with Mexican-American heritage can be judges, or no, you shouldn't be saying that about women, or you shouldn't be saying that about veterans. For me, as the voice for this district, I'd be standing up and saying, gosh, Mr. Trump, have you been out here? Do you know these places? Have you stood in our shoes? Because then you'd understand the trade and the relationships and the history and the fact that so many of us who've lived out here. I mean, we've got family on the other side, we shop on the other side, we do all sorts of things. This is really, that river has been a unifying force for generations.
Well, we want to talk specifics. If you are elected, what types of things do you plan to do you promise to do to try to change people's views on the border?
Well, I think it's important to do several things. I mean, in the first place, I think it's important for us as a community. One of the challenges in El Paso is that our participation rate in different things is not very high, right? And so one of the things is we've got to get our folks to show off El Paso and to talk about the importance of the border in our community and to talk about and highlight success stories. Because when many times these people come in here, they want to use the hyperbole, they exaggerate about this or that or the other. And I think it's important on us to say that's not accurate and to stand up and be strong for El Paso at every opportunity. The other thing is I think more people need to come out here and understand what our region is like. They've got to come out. Nobody knows, for example, that the 3 missions in El Paso are like 50 years older than the missions in San Antonio. We all know about the San Antonio missions, but, you know, frankly, so few people know about the history of this region, and we've got to do a better job of showing that off.
And educating people.
Absolutely.
Getting involved.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Mine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll see you again soon, I'm
Deal.
sure.
Absolutely.
We'll be right back.